My older brother asked me to scam our father for $50K to save his marriage. When I refused, he exposed everything to my parents, saying I was the selfish one, but my father discovered the truth. And what he did next left them all speechless. I'm 28 years old, I work in logistics, and I'm about to launch my own shipping business. And basically, I need to tell this story, because what happened a few months ago with my older brother still has my head spinning. The thing is, I always thought Patrick and I were close, you know, typical brother relationship where you fight over stupid stuff, but at the end of the day, you're there for each other. But it turns out all of that was a lie. Or at least, that's what I discovered when he decided his new life was more important than us. Patrick is 30, so only 2 years older than me, and we were always competitive, but in a good way, I guess. We grew up in a pretty comfortable house. Our father Henry is a retired heart surgeon. The man worked his ass off his whole life, and now he's in a good financial position. And our mother Barbara was a journalist before she quit to raise us. We never lacked anything. But we also weren't those spoiled kids who have everything handed to them. My parents were always firm about earning things and being honest, especially my dad, who's super strict about principles and integrity and all that stuff. Everything changed 5 years ago when Patrick met Nicole. She's 29 now. And look, I don't want to be the typical brother-in-law who hates his brother's wife, but this woman literally changed Patrick completely. Before marrying her, Patrick came home all the time, called mom every week, like we were a normal, functional family. But after the wedding, it was like someone had pressed a reset button in his brain. He started spending all holidays with Nicole's parents, stopped answering messages, and when we saw him, it was obvious he was there out of obligation, looking at his phone every 5 minutes. Mom would cry every Christmas because Patrick would send some last-minute excuse, and Dad would get increasingly upset but tried to hide it. Nicole comes from a family with money. Not as much as us, but let's say they're well off, and from the beginning it was clear she expected Patrick to meet a certain standard. They bought a house in a super expensive neighborhood, she drove a new BMW, they were always going to fancy restaurants and posting photos on Instagram. And Patrick worked in finance, made good money, but not enough to maintain that lifestyle without stressing out, you know what I mean? But he never said anything, just kept drifting further and further from us while trying to please his wife and in-laws. Meanwhile, I was building my life with Grace. We'd been together 7 years at that point, since college basically, and she's literally the most grounded and reasonable person I know. She works in education, she's an elementary school teacher, and she's never cared about all that materialistic crap that obsesses Nicole. We'd talked about getting married eventually, but without rushing, we wanted to make sure we were in a good financial position first. Last year, everything aligned, perfectly for me. After working 5 years at a logistics company, I finally had enough experience and contacts to launch my own shipping business. I'd saved up, gotten some investors, and was ready to take the leap. And right at that moment, Grace and I decided it was time to get engaged. I proposed in March. It was super simple, nothing ostentatious, just the two of us at the beach on a Sunday afternoon, and she said yes, obviously. 2 weeks later, Grace comes and tells me, "Hey, I think you should buy a pregnancy test." And I'm like, "What?" Because we weren't actively trying, but we also weren't being super careful. I guess. We bought 3 different tests, and they all came back positive. We were in shock at first, honestly, but then, the joy hit us like a train. We were going to have a baby. I was going to be a dad, and honestly, I couldn't be happier even though it wasn't planned. I called my parents immediately, and Mom literally screamed with excitement over the phone. Dad was calmer, but you could hear in his voice he was super proud and happy. They told me, "We have to have a celebration dinner. Invite Patrick too. We haven't seen him in months." And I thought, well, if anything is going to bring my brother back, it's this news, right? We organized the dinner for the following Saturday at my parents' house. It's a big house, 5 bedrooms, with a huge yard where we used to play when we were kids. I arrived with Grace around 6 in the evening. Mom had prepared a complete feast, and Patrick and Nicole arrived half an hour late. When they came in, Nicole had that fake smile she always puts on, super plastic, and Patrick looked tired and stressed, with dark circles and everything. The dinner started well. We were toasting to the engagement and the baby, Mom wouldn't stop talking about names and how she was going to be the best grandmother in the world, and Dad was happy though, trying not to show it too much. But then Nicole says, well, we also have news. And we all turn to look at them, and Patrick says, we're also having a baby. Obviously, we all got excited. Mom started crying with happiness because she was going to have 2 grandchildren, like it was perfect. Both brothers having kids almost at the same time. But then the energy changed super fast. Nicole starts talking about how difficult the process was, that they'd been trying for years, that they had to resort to in vitro fertilization, and that they basically spent all their savings on treatments. And Patrick looked super uncomfortable while she talked, looking at his plate and drinking wine like he wanted to disappear. Dad asks, why didn't you tell us you were having problems? We could have helped. And Patrick says something like, we wanted to do it alone, we didn't want to worry you. But there was something weird about how he said it, like he wasn't being completely honest. The dinner ended kind of awkwardly after that, with Mom trying to keep the mood cheerful but everyone feeling the tension. After dinner, when Grace was helping Mom with the dishes and Dad was outside smoking his pipe, Patrick pulls me aside into Dad's study. He tells me, brother, I need to talk to you about something. And I'm thinking he's finally going to open up about whatever is going on in his life. But no, what came out of his mouth was probably the lowest thing anyone has ever asked me to do. Patrick basically explains that he and Nicole are in serious financial trouble. The fertilization treatments cost like $40,000, and they paid for them with credit cards and loans because their insurance didn't cover anything. On top of that, they have the mortgage on the expensive house, car payments, and Nicole doesn't want to lower her standard of living even while pregnant. He tells me they're literally broke, that they don't know how they're going to pay for the baby, and that they need help. I tell him, why don't you ask Dad directly? He has money. I'm sure he'd help you. And Patrick makes a weird face and says, there's the problem. Dad is upset with me because I haven't been present, and if I ask him for money now, it'll look like I only come back when I need something. Then he drops his brilliant plan. He says, what if you ask Dad for money? Tell him you need like $50,000 for the business or for the baby or whatever, and when he gives it to you, we split the money. I keep $30,000 to pay off debts, and you keep $20,000 as compensation for helping me. I stood there, literally speechless. Was he asking me to lie to our parents, to scam our father, to get money from him? I told him, Patrick, are you crazy? Dad trusts me, and you want me to betray that trust to get you out of a problem you created by living above your means. And he starts with, we're brothers, we're supposed to help each other, I'd do the same for you, blah blah blah. I told him no, absolutely not. And then he changes tactics and says, well, then make me a partner in your new business. Give me 40% equity and I'll help you get clients. And I'm like, what? Patrick doesn't know anything about logistics or shipping. He's never worked in this industry, and he basically wants me to gift him almost half of something I've worked years to build. I told him, no way, brother, that's not how this works. I can't just give you a massive stake in my company because you're desperate for money. Patrick got furious, started raising his voice saying I was selfish, that I was always Dad's favorite, that I had everything easier. And I'm like, what are you talking about? We grew up in the same house, with the same opportunities. But he kept going, and finally Grace appeared at the door asking if everything was okay because she heard us yelling. We left that night with a horrible atmosphere. Mom asked what happened, but I just said Patrick, and I had a disagreement. Nothing serious. But in the car, Grace asked me what really happened, and I told her everything. She was horrified, like she literally told me, I can't believe your brother asked you that. That's manipulation and fraud, basically. A week later, Patrick shows up at my apartment on a Tuesday night. Nicole wasn't with him, and he looked worse than at dinner, like gaunt and with wrinkled clothes. He tells me, we need to talk about the other day. We didn't finish the conversation, and I'm like, Patrick, there's nothing to talk about. My answer is still no. But then he drops something that left me frozen. He says, do you know why I didn't go to my first choice college? Because I sacrificed myself so you could go to yours. Dad didn't have enough money to send us both to expensive schools at the same time, So I chose a cheaper university so you could have the best. And now that I'm asking you for a favor, you turn your back on me. This was new to me. I'd never heard this story before. Patrick applied to Stanford. I knew that. And he ended up going to a state university. That was good, but not at Stanford's level. I went to an expensive private university that gave me a partial scholarship, but honestly, I never thought about the logistics of how Dad handled the payments for both of us. I asked him, "Does Dad know about this supposed sacrifice?" And Patrick says, "Of course he does. Why do you think he spoils you so much?" "Because he knows I screwed myself over so you'd be okay." And I'm sitting there thinking, could this be true? Have I been living with this debt without knowing it? I told him I needed to verify this with Dad before making any decision, and Patrick got super defensive, saying he couldn't believe I doubted him, that he was my brother and I should trust his word. But something didn't add up, like Patrick had never mentioned this in 5 years, and just now when he needs money, he comes out with this story. The next day I went to my parents' house unannounced. It was Wednesday afternoon. I knew Dad would be home because he plays golf Wednesday mornings, and then comes back to rest. I found him in his study reading, and I told him we needed to talk about Patrick and about my college. I told him the whole story, about the plan to lie to get money, about the business equity, and finally about the supposed Stanford sacrifice. And my father's face. Man, I'd never seen my father so angry in my life. He turned red, the veins in his neck bulged, and he said, "That damn liar," Dad explained the truth to me. Patrick was never accepted to Stanford. He applied, yes, but was rejected. And then Patrick went to Dad and asked him to use his contacts or donate money to the university to get him in, like buying his way in, basically. And Dad flatly refused because that went against all his principles about honesty and earning things. Patrick got furious and ended up going to the state university where he was actually accepted on his own merit. And the part about not having enough money to send us both to expensive universities, that was also a lie. Dad had been saving specifically for our education since we were kids. There was more than enough money. I got a partial scholarship because I was a good student, not because Dad couldn't pay the full tuition. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. My brother had not only lied to me blatantly, but he'd invented a complete narrative where he was the martyr and I was the privileged son, all to manipulate me and get what he wanted. I asked Dad, "Why didn't you ever tell me about Stanford?" And he says, "Because Patrick asked me not to. He was embarrassed about being rejected and didn't want you to know. I respected his privacy, but now I see that was a mistake. Dad asked me exactly what Patrick wanted, and I told him everything in detail. The scam plan, the business thing, everything. And Dad just shook his head and said, 'That boy is lost. That woman ruined him.' Mom was listening from the doorway and started crying, saying it was her fault, that she should have been firmer when Patrick started distancing himself from the family. I told Dad, 'I'm going to block Patrick. I don't want to hear from him anymore for now.' And Dad says, 'Wait, don't do anything yet. Let me talk to him first.' But I was already decided. I got home and blocked his number, blocked Nicole too, and told Grace I didn't want either of them to know where we lived, even though they obviously already knew. Like 2 weeks of silence passed. I was focused on launching the business, signing contracts with clients, hiring staff, all that craziness of starting a company. Grace was in her second trimester and starting to show, and honestly, we were happy ignoring the family drama. And then one Saturday morning, like at 9, the doorbell rings. Grace was in the shower and I went to open it thinking it was a package or something. But no, it was Patrick and Nicole, standing at my door with faces of absolute fury. Nicole immediately starts with, "How dare you turn your parents against Patrick?" And Patrick, saying, "You told them lies. Now Mom cries all the time and Dad won't even answer my calls." And I'm like, I told them lies? You guys are the ones who came with a plan to scam our parents. I just told them the truth. The argument escalated super fast. "Nicole called me selfish," said Patrick, "and I were family and I should help him without asking questions. Patrick said I was always a mama's boy, that I never had to fight for anything, that everything was handed to me. And I honestly couldn't believe what I was hearing. Like, this is the same brother I grew up with. How did we get to this point? I told them to leave my house or I'd call the police. Nicole said something like, "Go ahead, call them, and tell them how you abandoned your brother in his worst moment." But Patrick pulled her by the arm and they left. Not before Patrick yelled at me that this wasn't going to stay like this, that he was going to make Dad see the truth. Grace came out of the shower, just as they were leaving, and found me shaking with rage in the living room. She hugged me and told me, "It's over, they're gone, let's calm down." But I was so angry. Like, who does he think he is to come to my house and yell at me after trying to use me for his dirty plans? I called my parents immediately and told them about the visit. Mom got hysterical, crying and saying she couldn't believe her son had become this. Dad was more controlled, but you could feel the disappointment in his voice. He said, "Son, I'm so sorry you had to deal with this. I'm going to handle the situation." Turns out Dad called his lawyer that same day. It's a lawyer who's worked with my father for years, handling his investments and his will and all that. And Dad instructed him to prepare a modification to the will. Basically, Patrick was going to be almost completely disinherited, except for a collection of antique watches that my grandfather had left to Dad and that were technically meant to be split between both sons. The lawyer contacted Patrick directly, sent him a certified letter explaining the decision and offering him an appointment if he wanted to discuss the situation. Patrick called Mom crying, saying Dad was cruel. How could he do this when they were expecting a baby? That Nicole was devastated. Mom tried to intercede, talking to Dad, asking him to reconsider. But Dad was firm, he said. That boy needs to learn a lesson about honesty and integrity, and if he thinks he can manipulate his family and get away with it, he's very wrong. Mom finally accepted, though she was destroyed by the situation. Like, seeing your family fall apart like that isn't easy for anyone. Like a month later, Patrick showed up at my door again. But this time he was alone, without Nicole, and he looked completely different. He was crying before I even opened my mouth, like real tears, not acting. He tells me, "Please, Vincent, I need you to help me fix things with Dad. I made a mistake. I know, but I can't lose my family." I let him in, but kept my distance. He sat in my living room and basically had a complete breakdown. He told me Nicole was furious with him for losing the inheritance, that his in-laws were pressuring him to fix the situation, that he felt trapped between his wife and his family of origin. And for the first time in years, I saw my real brother underneath all the facade and ego. I told him, "Patrick, I can't help you if you're not honest. With me and with Dad." And he admitted everything, about Stanford, about living above his means to impress Nicole and her family, everything. He said he knew the plan to scam Dad was wrong, but he was desperate and thought I'd understand, because we were brothers. I explained to him that being brothers doesn't mean lying and manipulating. It means supporting each other in honest and healthy ways. And that if he really wanted to fix things, he needed to go to Dad, admit everything, sincerely apologize, and prove through actions that he'd changed. Patrick was scared to face Dad, said Dad would never forgive him. But I told him, the only way to know is by trying. I called Dad that same day and told him Patrick wanted to talk. Dad was silent for a moment and then said, "Have him come tomorrow at 3. And the next day I went with Patrick to Dad's house. Mom opened the door and started crying when she saw Patrick, hugged him like she hadn't seen him in years, even though only a few months had passed. Dad was in his study and asked us to come in. What happened next was probably the most uncomfortable and difficult thing I've witnessed. Dad basically destroyed Patrick verbally, not with screaming, but with that cold, cutting disappointment that's worse than any yelling. He told him he'd raised him better, that he'd given him every opportunity, and that Patrick had chosen the easy path of lies and manipulation instead of working hard and being honest. Patrick cried, apologized 1,000 times, admitted everything. He said he'd gotten lost trying to be someone. He wasn't. That Nicole had expectations he couldn't meet, and that he'd made terrible mistakes. Mom was crying too, and I honestly didn't know where to put myself. Dad finally said, "I'm going to give you one chance, but it has to be on my terms." And then he looked at me and said, "Vincent is starting his business. He needs trustworthy people who work hard. You're going to work for your brother, Patrick. Not as a partner, as an employee. You're going to start from the bottom. You're going to prove you can be responsible and honest, and if after 2 years you demonstrate you've changed, I'll reconsider the will." Patrick looked humiliated, like working for his younger brother obviously wasn't what he expected, but he nodded and said, "I accept. I'll do whatever's necessary." Dad also said he was going to give them temporary financial help so they could pay their most urgent debts and prepare for the baby. But after that, Patrick was on his own and had to learn to live within his means. I honestly wasn't sure how to feel about it. On one hand, the idea of working with Patrick every day after everything that happened didn't excite me at all. But on the other hand, it was an opportunity to rebuild our relationship and for him to prove he'd really changed. That was like 4 months ago. Patrick started working at my company in September, in the operations department, basically doing logistics coordination and paperwork. It's not a glamorous job and pays less than what he made in finance, but it's honest. At first, it was super awkward, like he was clearly resenting it but trying to hide it, and I was constantly watching to make sure he wasn't trying to manipulate the situation somehow. But slowly, things have been improving. Patrick is being punctual, does his work without complaining too much, and occasionally comes to ask me for advice about personal things. He told me he's going to therapy, just him, trying to understand why he let Nicole and his in-laws have so much control over his life. He says Nicole isn't happy with the changes, but that he's trying to set boundaries with her for the first time in his marriage. Patrick's baby was born last week, a boy they named Henry after Dad. Patrick called from the hospital, and his voice sounded different, like more mature or something. He told me, "Thanks for not giving up on me completely. I know I didn't deserve it." And I didn't know what to say. I just told him, "We're brothers. That doesn't change, but trust has to be rebuilt." Grace and I had our daughter 2 months ago, a girl we named Sophie. Dad comes to visit her almost every day. He's the proudest grandfather in the world. Mom is also happy to have grandchildren, though she still gets sad sometimes thinking about how we almost lost Patrick completely. I don't know if things will ever be like they were before. Probably not, honestly. There are things that once they happen, they change the dynamic forever. But at least now there's honesty. And that's more than we had 6 months ago. Patrick has to earn his place in the family again. Step by step. Day by day. And if he really does it, if he really changes, then maybe in a couple of years we can have something that resembles a normal relationship between brothers. For now, I'm focused on my family, on Grace and Sophie, on growing my business honestly and through hard work, without shortcuts or lies. And if Patrick learns anything from all this, I hope it's that there's no substitute for integrity and hard work, and that real family isn't about manipulating each other, but supporting each other in honest ways even when it's difficult.